introduce Mousa Mohammadian, who is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the American University of Beirut. He's also a visiting fellow at the center this semester, and we've enjoyed being able to talk to him on a regular basis. Mousa got his PhD from Notre Dame a few years ago. He works in the general philosophy of science, in the history of philosophy of science, on metaphysics, and also on Islamic philosophy. He has published widely on a range of topics in philosophy of science, in the best journals, in Synthèse, on IBE, theoretical virtues, in philosophical quarterlies, on laws, as well as the European Journal for Philosophy of Science, also on laws. And today, Mousa will be talking about Peirce disappears, C.S. Peirce, and early logical empiricism.
His apologies, he can't be here today, and he has to speak up for him. Bonjour, comment ça va? Before I turn to introduce today's speaker, we have a couple of announcements. There's a lunchtime talk on Tuesday. Sayura Khan, is she here somewhere? No? Okay, well, you remember what she looks like. That's what she looks like. And she will talk on a commitment account of norm externalism. And then on Friday, April 19th, Thomas Eichardt will give the annual lecture series, Causal Abstraction and Computational Explanation, which will also be the Adolf Grunbaum lecture at the same time. Good. Now we come to the good part. It's my pleasure, true, and honestly my pleasure to introduce Mousa Mohammadian. Let me tell you just a little bit about him before he starts talking. He has his PhD in History and Philosophy of Science from Notre Dame, and the title of his dissertation was Theoretical Virtues in Science and metaphysics. Sorry, I couldn't get it out. Just couldn't get it out. Subsequently, he had appointments at the Institute of Vienna, so at the University of Vienna, at Ahmedabad University in India, and he is presently, when he's not here, an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at the American University of Beirut. As you know, Beirut is the Paris of the Middle East. It's better. Yeah, it's traditionally known as that. What you don't know is that Pittsburgh, seriously, has sometimes been called the Paris of the Alleghenies. I know this is a laugh line, but it's actually sorry. Mousa has written a lot of really interesting papers, some of them with really intimidating titles: Theoretical Virtues and Theorizing in Physics Against Independence of Theory Simplicity, and Avicenna's Flying Man in Einstein's LA. How intriguing. I'm so looking forward to that. I can't possibly imagine what that could be about. Now, to know Mousa is to learn a lot. And I have been so deeply informed. In particular, I have learned that there's not a single good idea that I have ever had in philosophy of science that's not already been thought of by Peirce and Nagel. This is a very good thing to know. There's something even more important that makes my acquaintance with Mousa just wonderful. We are, as a group, burdened by the immense weight of obligation of the material that we study. And as I look around at you, I can see you slowly sinking into your chairs as the weight on your shoulders becomes ever more burdensome. Mousa somehow has this amazing lightness of spirit. And the burden is just not there. He takes tremendous joy in the work, and I'm being deadly serious now. He takes tremendous joy in the work that he does, and it's hugely infectious. To have a discussion with Mousa in any community is to come away feeling enlivened and enthused. And you've brought that wonderful light to us. I've enjoyed immensely the time that you spent with us, and I'll be very sad when your time is up, because you will take that light away and you will be in a little darker place.
Here. We will get him back.
He will speak to us on this topic, and he'll tell us how to say that time.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you, Edouard, Sam, Chantel, Kelsey, and JP. Especially JP is the only one here. So it's been truly wonderful to be here at the center and very close to the HBS. And yeah, it's been a hell of an experience. So I'm very happy to be here. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about something that I didn't know, even the phrase is very controversial, that Peirce disappears. Okay, what do I mean? Peirce was the founder of a mathematician, logician, a statistician, chemist. He came up with, independent of Mendeleev, he came up with a periodic table of elements, geoscientist, so on and so forth. This is not the sense of disappearing that I'm going to talk about. In this sense, we are all going to be disappear, and Peirce is not really special. Scholars of HPS and HOPOS, which stands for History of Philosophy of Science, read and discuss a lot about the works of Pierre Duhem, Ernst Mach, Henri Poincaré, and the members of the Vienna Circle. Peirce, however, is not usually a name that appears next to these founders of this discipline that now we know as HPS. But in the early years of the logical empiricism, and I here roughly mean by early 30s, 40s, and 50s, this was not really the case. And Peirce's name appears a lot, as we are going to see next to Duhem, Mach, Poincaré, as those forerunners of this new philosophical esprit that manifests itself in logical empiricism. And this is what I mean by Peirce disappears. What happened that Peirce is not anymore considered to be a canonical figure in the history of philosophy and science? That's basically what I mean by Peirce disappears. So the outline of the talk is as simple as it gets. First, I'm going to convince you that Peirce received a very warm reception from several important sympathizers, proponents, advocates of logical empiricist movement in the United States. Then I provide some evidence, not conclusive, but I think very telling evidence that he got marginalized and he disappeared. And then I will talk about what happened, why Peirce actually was gone. These are basically the people that I'm going to cover, not equally, but the main players of the game here actually are Charles Morris, Ernst Nagel, Philip Frank, Hans Reichenbach, Justus Buckler, and Herbert Feigl. I assume that most of you know all of them. Probably Buckler and Charles Morris might be a little bit vague that I'm going to talk a little bit about. One player that is not in this list is, of course, Peirce. So it's a kind of odd thing that you are in a talk about Peirce, but you will not really hear me talking about the ideas of Peirce unless it is necessary for this historical narrative that I'm trying to give. Okay, so let's start with Morris. Charles Morris was an American pragmatist at the University of Chicago. He was a student of Herbert Mead, who was himself a student of William James. And he actually was very impressed by logical empiricism back in the 30s. And he was very instrumental in bringing logical empiricism figuratively and literally to the United States. He is the one who brought Carnap to the US. He is the one who arranged for Reichenbach to be able to actually come to the US. So he was very actually instrumental, and he became actually one of the editors of the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science next to Carnap and Neurath. What I'm going to do is actually I'm going to mention some passages from his early works in the 30s. And what I want you to pay attention to is who is the audience there and how he characterizes pragmatism in Peirce in general. I will start with the concept of meaning in pragmatism and logical positivism. It was actually a talk that he gave at the 8th International Congress of Philosophy in Prague to logical empiricists. His audience here are the Europeans, the logical empiricists. He starts with, the empiricist temper receives its most vigorous contemporary expression in the writings of the American pragmatists and in the writings of those who have been stimulated by the influences which have spread out from Vienna Circle. for convenience sake, these movements will be designated as pragmatism and logical empiricism. Well, I guess it's already clear that for him, pragmatism, American pragmatism and logical empiricism are not really two very different beasts. There are two movements that instantiate the same empiricism. Then he goes on and start talking about these two movements. Here are some essential points that I want to actually talk about. First, he is clear. These are two movements. It's not one movement. These are two movements. Their more immediate founders are Peirce and Mach, or Mach, as the German would say. And he says, he declares, the time is appropriate for more direct contact, and cooperation between the movements. And we come to this direct contact. Basically, in 1939, he brings the unity of science movement to Harvard. He basically brings logical empiricists to Harvard so they can actually bring to contact these two movements. And this is again a piece that he wrote for European audience. It is, as he says, published in the Dutch periodical Synthèse, and it actually even comes with a brief German translation. So it's clear that the audience is still European. And he's here talking about logic and the logical analysis of natural sciences. And he says, it is doubtful if in these respects, American achievements have yet been equal in their quantity and quality to the achievements of the other thinkers. Basically saying, in logic and logical analysis of science, you Europeans are better. Certainly, the main lines of contemporary development have not been directed from these shores. Okay? There is, however, a caveat. He immediately exempts Peirce. In logic and logical analysis of science, Americans are still behind, except for Peirce, which is not in the scene anymore here, but it's kind of, it's a very actually important point. I will come back to this soon. Now, the audience changes. Now, the proceeding of that Prague Congress is being published, and he is writing a review for that proceeding to the American audience. And then he writes, the publication of this material in book form makes contact easy with the most vigorous and the most promising contemporary movement in the logic of science and scientific philosophy. The movement draws together within itself the types of interest represented in the historical forms of empiricism, the more critical form of pragmatism, and the newer mathematical logic. It is therefore a logico-pragmatico-empiricism that has taken on a genuine international character. Similar tendencies can be found in Mach, Peirce, Poincaré, and Russell. So I want to actually draw your attention to two things. First, if you remember, for European audience 4 years ago, he was talking about two movements. For the American audience, it's one movement. It's not two movements, one. Apparently, he thinks that the contact has been so successful that now they actually merge together. And the other one is, again, the only American name that appears as like one of the forerunners here is Peirce. And this is probably the only name that disappeared later. Okay. So far that was for Marx. Now let's move on to the next verse. Now, I want to actually bring up the level of Peirceanism, if that's a word, to a whole new level, basically. So far, I just showed you that, when Morris was talking to Europeans, he was just saying Peirce. But now I want to actually show you that, no, like the influence of Peirce was very deep. And this, for this reason, I will talk about actually some of the philosophical developments. First, again, I'm going to bring some quotations just for the, to setting the stage, and then I will move on to some philosophy. So I told you about the Harvard meeting that they brought the logical empiricists to the United States. This piece actually is from Nagel's talk in that meeting. And the title is telling, Charles S. Peirce, Pioneer of Modern Empiricism. Nagel writes, no account of the development of contemporary empiricism is adequate which neglects the writing and the writings and the influence of Peirce. So if you're writing a book on the history of empiricism and there is not a chapter about Peirce, Nagel won't be happy. So it is appropriate that the 100th anniversary of his birth should be commemorated at this Congress. And then he goes on, this is an important phrase, he says, for the movement of which it is a manifestation, which is basically the logical empiricist movement, the movement of which it is a manifestation is engaged in a cooperative, intensive cultivation of the methods of the sciences with the help of the most advanced tools of modern logic. That's basically his characterization of logical empiricism. And then he says, and Peirce's intellectual career was also a single-minded devotion to this task. I want to actually highlight three things here. First, again, just like Morris, Nagel also emphasizes that Peirce was really good in logic. Why actually this is important for me? Here is a piece from the first time that logical empiricism is introduced to the US audience. It's by Bloomberg and Feigl. And they write, although the term logical positivism is perhaps the best among many poor ones, the name may suggest a mere rephrasing of traditional positivism. However, this is not the case. Indeed, it is precisely the union of empiricism with a sound theory of logic, which differentiates logical positivism from the older positivism, empiricism, and pragmatism. Others, like certain pragmatists, neglected pure logic entirely by confusing it with psychology. So this is the first time that logical empiricism is being introduced to the US audience, and Feigl and Bloomberg actually are saying that, yeah, pragmatists don't have a good idea about what's logic. And then it's just 2 years later, and then 3 years later, and then 5 years later, it's just Morris and Nagel just saying that, no, not Peirce, not Peirce. That was the first point. The second point that I want actually you to notice here is that how Peirce has been characterized. Peirce here has been basically characterized as a logical empiricism, which basically Nagel is saying that, Peirce was logical empiricism when being a logical empiricist wasn't true. And then there is the third point that I want to actually, it's a very important point, and that is, this is the 100th anniversary of Peirce. It's Peirce centennial. That's a very important point. So I give it a picture code so you remember it. And the picture code is a cute cat from American University of Beirut. So remember, when you see a cute cat, that was the 100th anniversary of Peirce. Let's move on. And then Nagel goes on and says, one is not minimizing the contributions of the Vienna Circle in pointing out that many of its recent views have been taken for granted for some time by American colleagues, largely because the latter have come to the intellectual maturity under the influence of Peirce. Again, Nagel telling them that a lot of the things that you came up with is not new for us. We read Peirce. Now, this matches very well. I mean, the first question you might ask is why he's talking about Peirce. When he has logical empiricists here, why he's talking about Peirce. And I think because he and Morris both try to correct some misconceptions. They knew that the logical empiricists didn't really know about Peirce, and they were not wrong. Again, it's Feigl. He clearly says that most of us in Vienna Circle really didn't know about Peirce. So, as he puts it, our ignorance was vast. So they did not really know about Peirce. Nagel and Morris are really trying hard to convince them that you need to pay attention to Peirce. Now, these are so far just quotations. If you are a cynical person would say, so far it's just lip service. Is there any real juice? Is there any real Peirce going on? Now I'm trying to draw a Peircean picture for you. Basically, I'm trying to draw a Nagelian picture and show you how much it is under the influence of Peirce. These are almost all the works that were published by Nagel from the beginning before the publication of his magnum opus, The Structure of Science. That's basically the time that I'm focusing. I'm going to color code this picture. The yellow ones are the ones that I haven't read yet, so I don't know what it is. Okay. Fellowship was short. I only got two. Okay. The blue ones are the ones in which Peirce's name is mentioned explicitly and approvingly. What do I mean by explicitly? You know, you can Control F Peirce, it is there. Approvingly means that there are different things, different ways. Peirce's idea is used to criticize Peirce. So it says, Russell said that. Peirce has shown this is wrong. Peirce's idea have been used in order to elaborate as a platform to come up with some new philosophical ideas. And sometimes just Peirce is right, end of the story. So this is what I mean by approving. Okay, now what are these ideas? Again, this is the only slide that is really about Peirce, from Peirce, and I cannot really go in any detail. The first idea is, of course, the pragmatic maxim. The idea that which Peirce actually introduced the classic version in his paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear. Basically, the idea here is that, you have a concept, you want to see what it means. Look at those objects that you use this concept to describe them in the world. Look at their practical bearings, and all those effects, all those practical bearings is exactly what that concept means, nothing more. It's just basically the pragmatic maxim. And Nagel uses pragmatic maxim and the operational theory of meaning basically interchangeably. For thing that's just an example of operationalizing concepts in practice, and that's me. So this is, for Nagel, primarily a theory of meaning. Fallibilism is another idea. Now you might say, who is not fallibilism? This fallibilism is very important because it's a very anti-foundational fallibilism. For any of you who know Carnap, early Carnap, Aufbau Carnap, that's the foundation of this project. That's the project. I want to reconstruct the whole world in terms of sense data. Why? Foundations. Self-corrective nature of science, the clearly Peircean idea, Peirce's theory of frequency interpretation of probability, and finally, do not block the way of inquiry, another work of Peirce. This idea that the way of inquiry should not block is probably for Peirce the most essential characteristic of science. There is a book recently by Short called Charles Peirce and the Modern Science. In that book, Short argues that this is actually the definition of science for Peirce. What is science? Restless spirit of inquiry. You should never block the road of inquiry. And in fact, fallibilism kind of comes from that, because Peirce and Nagel think that if you think there is something certain, then you will not question that. That belongs to the road of inquiry. And just one short anecdotal, how important it is, this idea of don't block the road of inquiry. This is basically Nagel's argument against Einstein's attempt to come with a unified field theory. You come up with a unified field theory, results in blocking the road of inquiry. The road of inquiry should not be blocked. That's a failure. So this is how important it is. Okay. So these are, the blue ones are the ones in which Peirce's name has been approvingly mentioned by, and those ideas have been introduced. And the green ones are the ones in which those ideas are mentioned explicitly, but Peirce's name is not explicitly mentioned. Now, I don't know how much Peirce you see there. I see a lot. So it's like Peirce a lot. Okay. Now I'm going to actually very briefly give you one philosophical framework that Nagel actually tries to come up with, relying on Peirce's idea. Example is mine, but the ideas actually have been coming from Nagel. So yes, if someone comes to you and asks you, what does 1 unit of force mean? The only way that, the only pragmatic maxim, the only thing that you can actually say in a make sensing way is what affects 1 Newton of force. And that is a unit of force when applied to a unit of mass, brings about a unit of acceleration. That's its meaning. It's not that, that's not just a form, that's its meaning. And then you ask, okay, what one unit of acceleration is, and that's change in 1 unit of velocity over 1 unit of distance, and 1 unit of velocity is basically, moving 1 unit of distance in 1 unit. That's basically. So the only way that you can tell me what is the meaning of a concept, in this case, a scientific concept, if you put them in a web of concepts, which basically is the holism here, through operational definitions. Now, this gives you kind of a Newtonian. But it says, okay, but it doesn't stop here because the road of inquiry is never blocked. It's an endless inquiry. Someone comes and says, okay, let's think about 0 second. Let's think about what does it mean for an event to happen 0 second before another event. Very straightforward notion in a Newtonian mechanics is just simultaneously, but then Einstein comes in and asks about another operational definition for simultaneity, and that actually gives you a whole new web of concepts, and that is by itself goes on, and then you come up with. And then Hegel says, but you might say, but come on, like 1 second, like I have a watch here, I can measure 1 second, and measurement gives me observation, and that's sense data, and sense data is certain knowledge. That's basically the whole point of alpha. Like it's just, you want to construct it on something that seems more or less certain. First, Hegel says, sense data is not even knowledge. Peircean idea, I cannot talk about it here, but it's not knowledge. Sense data is not knowledge. More importantly, it's not certain. And the reason that sense data is not certain is because you can problematize sense data in other contexts of inquiry. In psychology, sense data itself becomes the subject matter of your philosophical and scientific discussion. And then it itself can be then only understood in another network of concepts. And that goes ad infinitum. That's, you never block the road of it. Now I want to point two things. First, imagine someone does that not about physics or psychology, but about logic. Someone tells you that we can have different systems of logic with different rules of inference. And then if you ask, here for instance, if you ask Nagel, but I mean, anyway, can I trust my sense data? Can I trust, my point reading in physics? And then his answer is, it depends on the context. If you're doing physics, this point reading, good enough for doing physics. In psychology, you problematize that. No, you need something else to rely on. Now imagine you apply that on logic or on language. And then you come up with Carnap's different systems of language. And then the decision which one you want to pick depends on your goals. It depends on what's the reason for which you are conducting the inquiry. And it's based on pragmatic reason. Am I suggesting that Carnap came up with this idea under the influence of Peirce? No, probably under the influence of Nagel, who was under the influence of Peirce. I don't think Carnap read Peirce, at least so far. So in order to just give you a more explicit way that this was really the way that a lot of people thought about the relationship between this pragmatic picture of Nagel and logical empiricism, I want to bring about Justus Buckler. He was a student of Nagel. In 1939, he wrote his dissertation, which was published also called Charles Peirce's Empiricism. And there is a chapter on the relationship between Peirce's philosophy and logical empiricism. It says, the view of the left wing of the inner circle, Carnap and Murat, is essentially that of Peirce, with, of course, certain refinements. Empirical science is a system of observation. The general hypotheses are regarded as true if supported by basic statements, called protocol statements or protocols. Protocol statements do not necessarily have to be perceptual statements. Which statements will be regarded as basic depends on the context of investigation. So it was see that, yeah, that's a left. But remember, Carnap's name is mentioned here. This is late Carnap. Early Carnap was, Aufbau Carnap was very early. And of course, this comes from Peirce, this comes from Peirce, this comes from Peirce. And holism, Nagel gets it from one. Just again, in parentheses, decades before Quine talking about writing two dogmas of empiricism, Nagel actually gives you a very clear picture of underdetermination. All right. So the next person that I would like to talk about, what I want, is Reichenbach, right in his works. Thanks to Jason for the picture. I will jump from Reichenbach and his relationship with Peirce. If you have any question, I can talk about it in Q&A. Okay, let's move to Philipp Frank. Soon, most of you know Philipp Frank. He was one of the actually founding members of the Vienna Circle, a physicist, philosopher who came to the United States and became a professor of physics actually at college. I'm going to talk about one specific idea that occurs a lot of times in writings of Philipp Frank. And the earliest time that I found actually was in 1929. He wrote something on the physical theories of the 20th century and school philosophy. Alert, a school philosophy is bad philosophy for these people, okay? So whenever you hear a school philosophy, they mean something that is garbage. Literally. Not even garbage, meaningless. Like it's not even qualified to be bad. Just so what is the significance? It started. What is the significance of the present-day physical theories for general theory of knowledge, for epistemology? There are many physicists and school philosophers whose answer would be nothing. Doesn't matter. No matter what new things you come up in physics, those epistemologists or like bad physicists, they think that it doesn't really have to do anything with our theory of knowledge, with our epistemology. John is saying, preach, brother, preach. So what does he talk about here? What is he talking about here? He specifically mentions actually Emile Dubois-Reymond, who was a prominent French actually scientist. In 1872, he gave a famous lecture on the limitations of natural sciences, and he came up with this phrase, ignoramus et ignorabimus, which basically means we don't know and we will never know. He says science can give us a lot of things. Science can give us a lot of mathematical equations that describes how matter behaves, how energy behaves. But science can never tell us anything about the ultimate nature of matter, ultimate nature of energy. And therefore, he phrases this term that we don't know and we will never. It's not that science so far hasn't done that, it's science cannot do that. Now, this is basically what Frank calls a school philosophy. So it doesn't mean it's only philosophers, it's a school philosophy. And then he says, but however, we want to come up with a new thing, a new philosophy, which he calls scientific world conception. For those of you who are historically sensitive and you see 1929 and scientific world conception, it immediately reminds you of another document coming out in 1929 with scientific world conception in its title, Vienna Circle's Manifest. Okay, so I think it is quite clear. Now, what is Philipp Frank's depiction of how scientific world conception would treat this idea that we can never know the ultimate nature of energy, the ultimate nature of matter, and so on and so on? He actually introduces a kind of simple case, that something that physicists discovered, and that was the identity of light and electricity. Says, what does it mean to say light and electricity are identical? Says, we have light experiences. Basically, we observe some light-related phenomena, and then we assign some symbols to this phenomena that we observe, and it gives us a formal relation. So you come up with a mathematical equation that mathematically describes that phenomena that you use. And then you have some electricity experiences, and you assign some symbols to the phenomena of electricity or different aspects of it, and you come up with a formal relation. Identity of light and electricity only means that you come up with same form. That's it. And you see the only difference is the difference values that you give to wavelength in these two. And then it says, and then you use LE or, they're the same. You derive new equations. Now you assign phenomena to the symbols of the equations. That gives you new experience. And then that basically tells you, well, the identity was really up to something. You really picked on something different. That's all. And then he continues, identity of light and electricity then means an identity of mathematical relations between symbols. From the theoretical point of view, the solution of problem means the assignment of symbols to experiences, among which there exist relations which can be stable. From the more practical point of view, it means the possibility of obtaining control over one's experience with the help of this system of relations. It is not at all necessary to express it in such a way that something is said about the nature of light or electricity. So the answer of the scientific word conception to a school of philosophy is not that, oh no, science gives you the nature of energy. The answer is, what is that nonsense nature that you're talking about? Don't even talk about the nature of light and nature. It's just that. Just to remind those of you who have read the manifesto, science is just surface. There is nothing underneath. Okay, now, who are those people who undermine this school philosophy so we could come up with the scientific word conception? Who are these people who paved the road for the scientific word conception? And Nagel gives you three names: Mach, Duhem, Poincaré, and then another name. And William James.
Cheating.
Gives you William James, American psychologist William James, in his book Pragmatism, which introduced the pragmatic movement, so on and so on. This is the first time, and to the best of my knowledge, the last time that the name William James appears in this context. In fact, Philip Frank doesn't even talk about pragmatism, William James pragmatism. He only focuses on the French, the introduction to the French translation written by Henri Bergson. And once he came to know Peirce, the name William James actually disappears. All right. For instance, in his biography of Einstein, he writes, about this time, that's a kind of Vienna Circle time, there appeared independently in the United States a movement that is related to European positivism in its chief line of thought. In 1878, that's when the How to Make Our Ideas Clear was published. Peirce published an essay on the logical character of scientific statements. Like Mach and Poincaré, he pointed out so on and so forth. And then he goes on and says that, Peirce showed that the speaking of the actual nature is superfluous and useless. And if you're not convinced yet that this is related to ignorabimus, it says the unattainable something for which the despairing solution of ignorabimus was proposed has been recognized as a phantom, as a chimera that has nothing to do with science. And it has been shown by Mach, Poincaré, Peirce, and Dewey. It's kind of interesting, apparently, to compensate for mentioning James, he jumps from Peirce to Dewey without even mentioning Peirce. But it's a kind of interesting thing. But again, Peirce appears next to Mach, next to Duhem, next to these people who are considered to be the founders of what Philip Frank here calls positivistic pragmatist movement. All right. So let me wrap up the first part. Peirce received a warm reception from several of these representatives of the logical empiricists. And his influence was quite diverse. Logic, pragmatic theory of truth, operationalist theory of meaning, so forth. And the engagement with his work was quite persistent. It wasn't like, I kind of covered some of the materials from 30s to 50s. And then the engagement actually got more refined. You know, remember, it started from Morris just saying to logical empiricists that Peirce is cool, to getting to the point that, you know, it's like, so we have a right wing in a circle and we have a left wing in a circle. Let's make that separation. And Peirce is, so it just got more refined. It was like, and in the case of Nagel, of course, it seems that the whole platform of his philosophy of science, at least up to that point, was very Peirce. And his name actually appears next to Mach. By the way, just one point. To the best of my knowledge, the very first time that the right wing and left wing Vienna Circle appeared in print in English, at least, it was in that book, unless there is someone more that I'm not aware. So he was sitting next to Duhem, Mach, and Poincaré, and still he kind of disappeared. So when the first time that I started to think about this, that why, where did Peirce go? I did a very inconclusive test. I went to the library, Notre Dame, and then I took a lot of books on philosophy of science and history of philosophy of science. I checked 6,000, I checked indexes of 6,000 pages of books written on philosophy of science and history of philosophy of science. And Peirce's name only appeared in only 40 pages. And like around a third of them in just footnotes. In fact, if you remove Peirce's abduction, if you remove the casual mentioning of Peirce's abduction, that 40 page would be just dropped to like around 20 pages. This is something that I did that, you know, like this is, where is Peirce? Now there is a group of actually philosophers at Tilburg that they are doing some really text mining stuff about the history of philosophy in 20th century. And I really hope that, you know, once their program has written their program, they've started, I can reach out to them and say, oh, check Peirce for me, and then have a serious quantitative analysis. But one other way that we can see that Peirce actually really getting marginalized is this. Ayer, who used to be at least some point a poster child for logical empiricism, writes a book about the origins of pragmatism, and it is in late 60s. It is a time that Popper's falsificationism is considered to be the arch nemesis of logical empiricism. It's like the opposite extreme. And in that book, he says, oh, Peirce was actually a forerunner of falsifications. How far away you can go from Peirce is basically logical empiricism to go to, it was just basically a falsificationist. Another interesting evidence that I found, remember the cute cat? Okay. Just to refresh your memory, it was 1939, the 100th birthday of Peirce, and Nagel was basically talking about the importance of Peirce to logical empiricists. In exactly the same year, and I was, before coming here, I was kind of thinking that, yeah, it was late 50s, early 60s when Peirce started to get marginalized. But then you come here, you go to Nagel's archive, and you start reading Nagel's correspondence. Look at the date. This is a letter written to Nagel by Buckler, Justus Buckler, that we actually came across. In that he writes, I am sorry to say that the Peirce volume has evaporated. Only 2 or 3 of those invited having this. What's the background? Buckler is trying send an invitation to every hotshot philosopher of the time and ask them that University of Columbia Press wants to publish a book for the centennial of Peirce. Are you willing to send something? He sends it to like 15, 20 some people. And then he writes to Nagel and tells him only 2 or 3 of those who invited having accepted. The reasons were chiefly that prior commitment were responsible, but no one even requested postponement of the book. I think that a low degree of interest in Peirce is partly responsible, not at all surprising. when you come to think. Two Peirce scholars are talking to each other and they are telling each other, yeah, no one cares about Peirce. It's not surprising that we couldn't come up. And I couldn't find even a single volume dedicated to the 100th birthday of Peirce, founder of American pragmatism. I mean, that seems to be very real. So yeah, so it seems that the fading away of Peirce actually had begun way earlier than 50. Is the time number I had. Now, get to the last part of the talk. Why? What happened? Why Peirce is just sitting next to Duane Poincaré, other founders of this new spirit of empiricism, new temper of philosophical temper of the age, was kind of disappeared. Now, there are some explanations that whenever you talk with someone who has done work in Peirce, you come across it. I don't really think that there is anything wrong with them. I just think that they are not the best explanations. One of them was that his works were not accessible in both sense. They were not really available. Like a lot of his, like before publication of the collected works of Peirce in early 30s, almost all of his works were unpublished. So only those who had some close affinity to Peirce or his students really had access to his works. Very few of his works were published. This is C.I. Lewis, and he's not an empiricist, he's not a logical empiricist. He is like a pragmatist, he's like a hardcore pragmatist. He says, but Peirce has something that the quality of a legendary figure in American philosophy. His originality and the wealth of his thinking are not fully evident in his published writing. This is 30. The collected works has not been published yet. Apart from a few persons, some of his most important conceptions can have had little influence because they have never been printed. This is obviously a fair point. I think this is an important point. But again, we saw like first in the early 30s, his work was published, and then we saw that people like Maurice, Nagel, Philipp Frank, Reichenbach, that I didn't talk about, Weigel, they really do pay attention to it. So it cannot be the whole story. Another, I think, important point to mention was the unhistorical attitude of logical empiricism. Unhistorical attitude is the phrase comes from Nagel. So Nagel goes to Europe, and then he writes two very good reports that he calls them Impressions and Appraisals of Analytic Philosophy in Europe, 1 and 2. This is from 1. And I think it's the first time that analytic philosophy is used for what now we call analytic philosophy. It's just this. And then he writes this about logical empiricists. The student whose primary interest is the history of ideas will find that, with some important exceptions, they will profit little from talking with these men. Neither the genesis of doctrines nor their sociological settings are interests cultivated with much hope. The great figures in the history of philosophy and the traditional problems associated with them receive only a negative attention. And Nagel doesn't like that. Thinks that these people are too ahistorical. They really don't read history of philosophy. They don't pay attention to the history of philosophy. And he complains about it. I think that that's a very important factor for those who actually, at least those logical empiricists who ended up in the US, even though they had access to works of Peirce, they generally looked very suspiciously at history of philosophy. Again, remember, I told you, the school philosophy, whenever it appears, it means something really bad for us. I think, however, the more important reason is this. I think the more important reason is, even by those who read Peirce, Peirce was characterized as an incomplete logical empiricist. And this happens. Morris does that. Morris basically says Peirce is a logical empiricist with some extra metaphysics. And Nagel, remember, he gives like a description of what is logical empiricism, and then he says Peirce's intellectual career was also a single-minded devotion to that task, which is factually incorrect. Now, this I can see. Well, this can be a good rhetorical strategy to convince a group of people like logical empiricists to take Peirce seriously. You want to emphasize the similarities. You want to tell them, oh, look, these are like how similar we are. But it has its own baggage. And the problem with this is that those ideas of Peirce that were considered to be unfit for this logical empiricist, in the logical empiricist framework, was just completely. And these were some very important ideas that had they not been ignored, probably Peirce would not lose, his stature as a prominent philosopher. So these are the ideas I told you that, was Nagel. I mean, now let's go back to Nagel. Nagel is a very good example of Nagel took like this, some of the most important ideas of Peirce very seriously. But then there are some other ideas that was not a good fit for a logical empiricist framework, and Nagel touches upon them and then let them go. It is really hard to find traces of proper discussion of these ideas. I'm going to talk actually about two of them that are very closely related. Almost. This is actually a characterization of Peirce, the most important contribution of Peirce by. What does it mean to say we know something in a universe in which events are uncertain and perception is fallible? Knowing cannot be a matter of an individual mind mirroring reality. Peirce's conclusion was that knowledge must therefore be social. It was his most important contribution to American thought. And when he recalled late in life how he came to formulate it, he described it fittingly as the product group. This is very important. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this is one of the most, I think the most important contribution of Peirce. And that is the social character of knowledge. And Peirce was very clear about that, especially for science, especially for that knowledge that you want really to take serious. The community of scientists, the ideal community of scientists, the non-ideal community of science, moving from the social relations of things. And this is one very important idea that actually is neglected. Nagel touches upon this idea twice in one writing and then just moves on. He talks about two fundamental insights that are integral to Peirce's thought: the recognition of the central role played by symbols and language in human behavior and knowledge, dear to logical empiricists, language, symbols, and the recognition that human knowledge is an achievement of biological organisms functioning in social contexts. For Peirce, knowledge thus becomes identifiable as the product of overt behavior involving cooperative effort in a community of inquirers, rather than something that is only done within you. Now, both of these are very important. Both the biological element and the social element are very important. What is the biological? We can talk about it in Q&A if you want to know more about it. Okay. And then, why this part of Peirce's idea was ignored? Part of it, as I just said, this was not like very well fit with the general broad logical empiricism, but there was also other contingent. There was also other contingent matters to the icy slope of logic. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of philosophy of science in the McCarthy era, in the Cold War era. If you are not, these are some things that you might want to check in. The idea here is this. These philosophers of science used to be, even logical empiricists, especially the left-wing logical empiricists, used to be very socially, politically conscious. And they really thought that science is not really something absolutely separated from the social context, from the political context. And they tried a lot. They really incorporated those ideas in their work. But then the Cold War happened. Then the McCarthy era happened. And there was a kind of huge shift in the strategy from social, political, economic components of science to only the logical analysis of scientific theories. It's a contingent historical fact, and I think these works actually are quite good. Like, especially like Reich, for instance, has used the Freedom of Information Act and got all the FBI's file of Carnap, Reichenbach, so on and so forth. So a lot of really interesting stuff. And we see that the pragmatism actually gets marginalized in general, partly due to its very strong engagement with the social and political aspects of science. So, why did Peirce disappear? I think his works was not available and or accessible. I think it's a good, important issue, but I don't think it explains a lot. More importantly, I think I forgot to put the unhistorical attitude of logical empiricism here. That's another issue. But he was also portrayed as an incomplete logical empiricist, which helped for some of his ideas to get reception. But at the same time, those ideas like the biological and social aspects of science that were unfit within the general framework of logical empiricism. And this was especially catalyzed by the Cold War environment's influence on the philosophy of science. Thank you.